All right, everybody, welcome to the Cinco de Mayo edition of the Scrum Professionals Meetup. And tonight I am super thrilled that we've got Ollie talking to us. I met Ollie back in 2019. He took my certified Scrum Master class back then. And then a little while later, totally separately, I did some training for a biotech company called Mantra Bio. It was like January of 2020. So, the pandemic was maybe on the horizon, but, it certainly wasn't here yet. And after that training, sometime after that training, Ollie joined that company. And he and the co-founders, Alex and Katie, got talking, and they introduced Ollie and I again, and ever since then we've been talking about doing this session because Ollie's got some really exciting and interesting experience. So he's actually used Agile practices, Scrum and related things now at 2 biotech companies. So he was kind of originally a biological scientist. He also describes himself as an organizational architect. And he says he loves the excitement of scientific discovery and innovation, but he's actually even more passionate about rethinking and re-engineering the processes that the scientists use, when they're achieving those outcomes. After 3 years as the head of R&D at System 1 Biosciences, which apparently now is called Herophilus, Greek something or other. I got to tell you, I just see a big elephant for some reason when I see that, or maybe the Snuffleupagus from Sesame Street. But anyway, so that company's changed their name. So after 3 years of being head of R&D over there, that's when he really shifted his focus more in the organizational development space. So he is the chief of staff over at Mantra Bio, which is a drug development biotech company. He's a self-described Agile enthusiast, writer, startup coach, and windsurfer. And he told me that his favorite place to windsurf is outside of the Berkeley Marina. So I'm super excited that he's here. And Ollie, the floor is yours.
Gotta unmute. I'm gonna pull the chat in the front, make sure that I see everybody. Alrighty. Chat. Got you all. Okay, lots of windows to set up. If I'm ever looking to the side here, not looking at the camera or looking too much to the right, then it's probably because I'm checking on my notes because I'm blanking on what I wanted to say. So thank you all for being here and taking the time to actually, listen to my experience, I would say, and hopefully after on, share your thoughts and discuss about, maybe something that you found inspiring and something that, where you think I went wrong or you have a suggestion on how we could do better. What I'm going to be talking about today is basically my experience around Agile biotech and the successes and just the challenges that we see there. I posted my LinkedIn contact in the chat if you want to connect later on. And so, as Chris pointed out, really my passion is with building exceptional biotechs because I love science, but what I love even more is, creating environments where people that think like scientists and that are willing to, do the impossible over and over again, actually have fun. And, the biotech industry has been around for quite some time. And, there's certain systems in place and it can be very competitive. And so I'm trying to, figure out ways that I can take some of the goods that we have, learned from the software world and the startup world and implement them in the biotech space to, create the new biotech, version 2.0, basically. And as Chris said, I used to be a research group leader myself, so I have a PhD in molecular biology. I'm a stem cell expert. And what I actually worked on in there with my team was growing human mini brains and testing them out for drug discovery. So if we want to talk science, we can do that. But I eventually transitioned out of that role and focused on, the organizational architect focus I wanted to have when I joined Mantra Bio. I've been with them now for almost 2 years. And so the experiences I'm going to share with you today are basically around both of those times, because I've implemented Agile with Herophilus specifically for my research group. And then at Mantra Bio, it was across the whole company, and they already have done that. And so basically I came in to figure out what worked and what didn't. And, I'm going to share my learnings there. And so like every good stories, I think this one starts with a coffee chat. And it started when I was a research group leader, and my CEO came back to me and kept pushing and said, like, hey, when are you going to be done with that development? We need to put it on a Gantt chart so we can show it to the investors. And I said, I can put it on the Gantt chart, but I can't promise you that that shit will be done, right? It's like, we can run 5 experiments and there's a high likelihood of that, none of them will work. And he's like, okay, fine. But I was really frustrated about that experience. And so I talked to a friend of mine who back then worked at Crunchbase, and I walked him through what we did. And, he said, why don't you just try this Agile thing? We do this in software all the time. And, I just did this training with this crazy guy, Chris, and he's like, amazing, and you should try it. And so, I looked into Agile a little more, and I thought, there's actually some similarities. I'm going to talk about that as well. And I just said, okay, let's sign up with Chris and see how it goes. And so what follows is basically, the history of what happened. And one thing that I really want to put out here is, this is a big disclaimer. I'm sharing my personal experience and observations, and I don't claim to be right. I don't have a solution that translates. I think Chris actually said that's exactly the challenge that he sees with many companies adopting this, is that they think there's a one standard set that works for everything. I don't think I have that. I don't want to claim that. What I hope is that I can inspire you to think about, adopting Agile in specific ways, knowing from my learnings. And that's why I look forward to sharing my ideas. And I would like to do a quick question to the group, just to get a sense for whom I'm dealing here with and what the level of detail is that I can, should be going into. And so I'm going to look in the chat. And the first question that I have is, who of you are scientists or are working in biotech and are, looking into Agile? Maybe there's somebody, nobody working? Okay.
I used to, but not anymore.
All right. Doug, David, Season, Henry. Okay. So that's 4, 5. Okay. 6. But as a software engineer. So that's an interesting combo then, huh? Medical devices, very interesting. That's gonna, there's lots of discussions we can have about that space as well. Okay, cool. All right, so we've got some folks with science background. I love that. And then the second question is like, what's the level of expertise here in the room when it comes to Agile? Are you novices or are you experts? If you think you're in between, go for expert. Okay. All right. Okay. Good. Yeah. So we've got lots of people with, I would say, at least a certain level of Agile experience, as well as like project management experience. And I think that's really, really cool. Used Agile for a few years. I would consider you an expert then, Charlie. All right. So I think that's good. I think I might have, insights for all of you, at least I hope so. And I'm going to kick things off by talking about what research, particularly research, means and how it goes in a nutshell, at least how I see it. And so if you think about research, what, for those of you who work in software, to me, it means is that humanity has a known space of knowledge, and the attempt of research is to discover something that's in the unknown space of knowledge. And so if you're thinking about, developing a new technology or a new therapeutic, what you're trying to do is actually expand that knowledge space and move into that unknown space to actually reach a discovery. And what's really key here is that is actually a hard process that's pretty random and you're failing a lot of times. So you have to do a lot of attempts on trying to get to where you want to go. It's not very linear because of the knowledge that you lack. And so in practice, what that looks like, we're using the scientific method as scientists. And I abbreviated it here, but basically comes down to, in order to get from known space into the unknown space to hit the discovery, you have some hypothesis on how you can get there. And so you design an experiment to test the hypothesis, you run the experiment, you measure the outcomes, you learn from the outcomes, you probably take some time to, think about what that means, and you're probably going to design a new experiment and try again, right? And so the process in itself is actually very iterative and looks very similar to, what you would do in Scrum. And so that's what I had in mind when I talked to my friend during the coffee chat, and he said, these iterative cycles, that could really be working for you. And I said, okay, great, let's try this out. And so I did the training, and after the training, I did some thinking on how I would implement, the classic Scrum cycle and what I would need to change in order to make it work for the scientists. And so, put Agile here on the left, but really the original piece was Scrum cycle. And so I thought, would it make sense to do 2 weeks? Would it make sense to do 4 weeks? Chris is always like, try to keep it, start at 2 weeks and then see if you need to extend it. There were some conversations that I had with my scientists where the classic response from any scientist is like, my experiments takes longer than 2 weeks and doesn't fit in the sprint. So that's like every scientist I've talked to. And I can tell you there's ways around it, but you're gonna hear that, comment. The one thing that I really focused on was thinking about how we prioritize work and how we go about doing work. And so when I looked at the product backlog refinement, I thought, okay, what's really our product here and how do we, adjust that to science? And so I decided to, rebrand that a little bit, also because I kept throwing PBR around and product backlog refinement, and people were looking at me like, I was from Mars. And so I said, we're going to call it experiment design review. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk through, how we design experiments together so that we can actually design better experiments, right? And and slice them up into individual packages, work packages that we want to be doing. And then we commit to those and start doing the work. And what ensues afterwards is really, after you've done the breakdown, you set priorities for the sequence of the packages that you're doing, and you run through your 2-week sprint by, you have your daily scrums to coordinate. And then after 2 weeks, you basically just review, what you've accomplished and try to optimize your process. And then you repeat. And so what did I see after rolling this out with the team? So I did a training with them. I told them how to do story points. And so they were really excited about this. And so the first thing that I saw was actually something that other people have now told me as well from other companies that's really impactful, is by forcing scientists to do an experiment review before they actually do the experiment, it actually saves a huge amount of time. Because typically what happens in science is a scientist decides to run an experiment, and then they present the results, after the experiment is done. And then somebody asks a question like, hey, did you do this one experimental control? And if not, all of your experiment is meaningless. So by having the group actually come together and think about the experiment design and the appropriate controls, we could, circumvent a lot of that. Also, I have this little comic here. It also prevented the issue of people often thinking in plan A and not in plan B. And so that made things a lot more effective. Other than experiment design review, what I also saw is that, when the team started really working together on chopping up the experiments and then helping each other out with the experiments, there was a lot of perceived transparency because everybody knew what everybody was working on. And it actually led to a better engagement with the, within the group. Now, there's something that's very specific about research that I think does translate to a certain extent to software world, but not fully. And that is that science is so hyper specialized that even if you put a Scrum team of 6 people together that are supposed to solve one problem, you might actually have 6 experts in the room. And one expert might not be able to carry out something that another expert is doing. So to get to a point where you actually have fluidity in the team and you can do, appropriate reshuffling, right? You can say, I think in software is like, hey, I'm going to build this piece of code, and then, oh, I'm stuck here, but maybe you can build this piece of code, right? That transition is a lot more challenging depending on the complexity of the science that you're doing. You might have somebody that's an expert in one thing who's not able to perform another experiment. And so really what I learned in the process is to think about my team in a way that I diversify the techniques that they were capable of carrying out. And then once I did that and multiple people were capable of carrying out the same experiments, there was a lot more fluidity, which then led to the third point here, which is better resourcing. So something that often happens in research is because it's biology and biology is not very predictive, and you grow up your cells and, your cells might be having a bad day or there's something, unforeseen in the setup that you did. Your cells might not be ready for the experiment that you wanted to carry out on the day when you need them, which means that there's a resource that was, tasked for a specific work package that would actually be free. And so by knowing the individual pieces and having them on our board together, the team could then say, my cells didn't grow up, but I'm happy to do this, immunohistochemistry staining for you. Can I do this? And then, yeah. And so that's where a lot of the engagement came from. Something that was really helpful for me as a manager of that group, I put our burn chart here on the right. This is still the manual version of it. It did allow me to do two things. One, I could track the effort that we're putting in at every sprint. And that gave me a sense of when I added people to the team, would that actually increase, right? Would actually more work be getting done? And the second thing is it allowed me to, go to leadership and be like, hey, if you want me to predict when this is going to happen, we thought about the plan that's involved in here. I'm thinking it's going to be, 6 to 8 sprints, and we'll have a result where we at least know whether we can proceed or not. So there was a little bit better, predictability in the work. And then one thing that I found missing in the original Scrum setup was this metric that I called chores. People later on complained that we shouldn't be calling it chores. And that is basically the work that the scientists do to simply keep the lab running. So there's a ton of work that goes into maintaining the cells, cleaning up the incubators, stuff that you have to do just to be able to do your experiments. And depending on the complexity of the experiments, this number could actually eat up to 60 to 80% of your team's resources. And knowing that would actually allow me to predict better when my experiment in the end would get done. It also gave me a handle to say to the leadership team, like, hey, if we're taking on these responsibilities from this other team, our score, chores score metric is through the roof, and we won't be able to do any experiments, right? So there's a lot of value in having that metric, particularly if you're having recurring tasks that the team needs to be performing. All right, and so want to end with the part on what I did with my research group by putting some quotes from the team out there, right? And so people were really happy actually to see what other people were working on. I think that's consistent, to any Scrum team that you talk to. People really like getting praise for the smart experiment designs that they had. So that was a positive. People were saying I can plan much better ahead. I can know how I can help others. And I see us making progress more, right? Because the challenge is if you're constantly, missing your milestones, right? It's very easy to get disheartened as a scientist. However, if you're seeing that you're actually, progressing on the experiments and you're putting in the effort, science actually becomes more of a game of like trying it again, doing more shots on goals, rather than just celebrating that one win. The one complaint that I think I've heard now from every scientist as well is this is just simply too much planning. And I think that has a lot to do with how scientists are brought up in the academic scenario. And so for me as a manager of that team, I saw the benefit of people planning appropriately and people saying like, this is actually better. So I'm willing to bite the bullet and have them complain once in a while if it's too much. All right. And that leaves that piece of, for the individual research group. And now what I want to transition to is how, agile practices actually play out if you roll them out, across a whole company. And so after my stint at Herophilus, I joined Mantra Bio as a chief of staff. And Mantra Bio was similar to Herophilus in that they had a very strong software team. So there were people that were used to running Scrum in the organization already. And the founder of Mantra Bio actually came from the the data science side. And so she actually laid it out for the whole company, and they were basically building out the company based on an existing Scrum structure and a Jira platform that they're using. And so Mantra Bio, in contrast to Herophilus, and I saw that some people are here actually in the medical devices space. Biotech is a large conglomerate. There's many ways that you can do biological science. Mantra Bio was a platform technology company plus a therapeutics company. And I think in the later times, we've now shifted to focus more and more on being a therapeutics company. And you'll realize that some of the challenges that I'm going to be talking about here are exclusively related to being a therapeutics company, and they might be different for a platform company or a medical device company or bioservice company. Right. And so when I joined Mantra, they were 19 people. The whole company was running on Scrum. They had 4 Scrum teams that were organized functionally out of, it sometimes still is. So they were not cross-functional Scrum teams that were working on specific project, but they had functional teams that they called Scrum teams. And in fact, many of those Scrum teams were working on multiple projects, with every scientist within that project within that team having their own project. And so things that I saw basically joining, the CEO asked me, just like, hey, we're trying this out. We think this is great. It has a lot of potential. Please take a look at what we're doing here. Take your own experience and tell me what's working and what's not working. And so I did that for a couple of weeks, just taking the backseat and observing. And what I saw is that there was a huge dedication to the process. And I think that's something that a lot of companies that are trying to adopt Agile after they had something else are really struggling with. Because this wasn't the DNA of the company already, adoption was pretty high. And people really got into creating Jira cards and tracking their progress. They also had a very high willingness to learn. So that was really cool. Information flow in the company was really high. And there was a perceived, full data transparency. Mind you, this team back then was, pretty small. And what they would do is basically have sprint review days where every Scrum team would have a 1.5-hour sprint review, and everybody else from the company would join that same, sprint review, and then they would all share the data, and it would be like a 6-hour day of just sitting in Zoom meetings, sharing, data, and scientists love sharing data. What I also saw is that some of the teams, like the operations teams, worked with the concept of epics. So they created these epics, as I think Jira calls them epics. I don't know if they're always called epics, but these work packages that had specific tasks in it. And the operations team, because they had so much repetitive work to do from sprint to sprint, they literally just had a section of epics, and they would just copy them, and they knew immediately what they had to do for the next 2 weeks. So that made their planning extremely effective. Now, that wasn't a lot of project work, right? But for standardization of work, this I think also worked. Now, on the bad side, I think there's a few things that I want to highlight. One, the sprint reviews, being a 6-hour event on a Friday where the whole company is busy, weren't really that effective. There was a lot of time sunk into that. And one of the issues was that the way that they went about sprint reviews, instead of saying, okay, this is a update on key progress and we're demoing out a product to a set of stakeholders, they instead said, okay, this is a update where everybody presents all the work that they did, independent of whether it's actually repeated and useful. And instead of having a subgroup of stakeholders, we'll have the whole company attend, right? And so as the company was growing, I knew that had to break eventually, right? We had to aggregate the information in a different way and share it. Cross-functional efforts were complicated, and I think that came mostly because the Scrum teams that they had built initially were all built around function. And then I highlighted at the bottom 2 really key issues that I think many companies will run into, and that is, one, they had a huge role conflict. And I recently talked to Chris about this, where the Scrum teams had product owners. But because the scientists in those Scrum teams had their own projects, and they were the project owners or project architects, the PAs, they were basically doing what they want, right? So the way that the Scrum teams would work is like, the PO would act as a scrum master, setting up the meeting, and then the scientists would come to the table, and everybody started, yeah, this is my project, this is what I'm going to do next, and the PO says, yeah, okay, fine, you're the expert on this, but I have no decision-making power, right? And so that was really bad for prioritizing work. And when I joined, the company was running on 16 projects. Mind you, that was 19, I was number 19, right? So 16 projects on 18 people. So basically every scientist that was there had their own project. And we tried to tie it together with an OKR structure where the company goals were set in OKRs, and then we tied the projects to the individual key results and objectives that we're setting. And that lack of that lack of focus is my last point. It's like there were so many projects and there wasn't a clear prioritization scheme and a clear goal scheme that came out of this playing around with what Google is doing might also work for us, let's try it. And I think that lack of focus was really where most of the learnings came in. And that's where the journey really, an understanding on what pieces out of the Agile workspace work for biotech, particularly therapeutic development, and which one don't really start. Okay, and so, oops, let's click here. Down to the learnings. So these are going to be the beefy slides. This is where the content really is. Number one, and I think this is really key for anybody who thinks adopting Scrum and Agile, will benefit them. And I put them out there because when I had my chat with my friend in the with the coffee chat about whether I should be adopting Agile, I had the hopes that some of these things that I have written down here would also be solved by Agile because my other company was struggling with it. But learning about it and testing out, in the end, it doesn't, right? And so these are really key, right? So running Scrum and Agile teams does not replace the need for a solid strategy with clear goals and a company roadmap. If you don't know what your goals are, right, the bottom-up approach of having the teams be the deciders of what you want to do is just going to get you into a mess. Second, yes, the teams are organized, around projects and it's very flexible, but that does not mean you can not have good people managers. A PO does not replace good people manager. In the end, the PO can manage and the Scrum Master can manage the process, but the people managers really need to manage the people. And then lastly, yes, you're creating some form of organizational structure, but if you're superimposing Agile onto a bad organizational structure already with unclear roles and unclear accountability, it's actually not going to solve that. It's actually going to make it worse, right? So when I think about Agile, and that took us a long time, right? Initially, there might have been this uncertainty around, is it actually a strategy piece or is it a tactical implementation piece? And to me, it is very clear now, it's really good in tactical implementation, but it's not a very, very solid strategy piece. So you've got to find a way that you can lay out the strategy, and then you can translate that strategy using Agile. All right. So from an organizational perspective on an Agile therapeutic company, I basically want to answer a couple of questions. That's why, when, and how to be Agile in a therapeutics company. And what I want to start here with, because I think is absolute key, is to talk about what therapeutics development actually looks like in a nutshell, right? So the goal of therapeutics development is, in the end, to have some sort of medical compound that you can administer to a patient that heals, a disease. And the way that you get there is basically by going through 3 phases. So the first phase is typically therapeutics discovery, or that's the research phase, where you try to identify possible compounds that you can, that might have the potential to actually cure the disease. And this, this phase is really all about iterating quickly, many shots on goals, failing fast. So it ticks all the boxes for, a perfectly Agile project focus. You basically want to get to a proof of concept as quickly as you can. So that's your discovery or your tech development piece. And from my own, perspective, really focusing on, time boxing this whole environment rather than setting clear milestones is the better approach, right? So if you set milestones in the TX discovery, phase is, you're most likely to just miss your milestones all the time. It's much better to say like, hey, I'm going to give you 3 months. The team goes and you figure out the best way on how we potentially could reach X. And then in 3 months, we come back and we assess the situation and we might pivot or change direction again. In the development phase, things change, right? So the discovery phase might have put out one compound that is now your proof of concept. And in the development phase for the therapeutic, your goal is to actually prepare the data pieces that allow you to talk to the FDA. Right, so the key step to getting to a drug that you can throw into humans is through talking to the FDA in what's called an IND filing that then defines what the clinical trials would look like. And so the FDA is very particular about what they want to see for drug development pieces. They want to see certain efficacy pieces, safety studies, in vitro data, in vivo data. And what that means is that in the therapeutic development phase, you're doing product development as you would define it as software, but you do it on a very regimented schedule and a very regimented path, right? So there's a very clear roadmap that you want to be hitting. And there's actually neither there's a lot of iterations that you can run because therapeutics development is very expensive, nor is there a lot of flexibility to say, oh, I'm just going to go back and try again, right? The risk is really high there because it's so expensive and because the FDA really wants to have this one data package. It's much more of a hit a milestone, make a go, no-go decision, hit the next milestone, next go, no-go decision, hit the next milestone, next go, no-go decision, right? So classically, the companies are organizing that in a phase gate process. And I think there is warrants to why that works well. Now, if you think it from, I've talked a lot about roadmaps and milestones now, and to me, that's a strategic piece, right? That's what the team is executing on. There's still a way to, on the tactical level, when you think about actually executing the work, to still run that with Agile principles. So you can still have your 2-week sprints, the people can still plan their work in the PDR or whatever you have. It's just that it's very clear what they have to work on next because the roadmap has been defined and there's actually not a lot of wiggle room. I still think that the SCRUM principles make it actually more effective to coordinate particularly cross-functional teams, but you get less of the upside of having a truly independent team that gets together to solve a certain problem. Now, let's say you've gathered all the scientific information that you need to talk to the FDA, and you lay out a clinical trial plan, you move into the clinical trial phase. And that phase, to me, is basically one big iteration cycle. It's a single cycle that takes 6 to 7 years and about $300 to $500 million. And I think a key difference here to software development is that we still don't have a product, right? We're still pre-revenue, the risk is extremely high, and we basically get one attempt on shots on goal. And that's the reason why drug development is so expensive, because most of the time that stuff actually fails, and you try to de-risk as much as you can upfront. And so I think the best way to summarize the clinical trial phase is to say the FDA does not attend your sprint reviews. Right? It literally you get one meeting where you finalize the plan, and then they say, okay, now you recruit the patients and you go, and we'll talk again, in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 when you start reporting. Yeah, so thinking ethically about it, I was in the, initially I had so maybe there's a way that we can try to do drug development with quick iteration cycles. But if you do this ethical thought exercise, you would say, okay, let's take what we've gotten out of the therapeutics discovery phase, and that might be 98 or 100 compounds, and 98 of them are either toxic or don't do anything. And then you go out and say, okay, I'm going to find myself some patients, and I'm going to tell them hey, we're going to test this array of 100 drugs. 98 of you might die or not do anything, right? But we're going to take the learnings that we got from there, and then we're going to optimize the drug, and we're going to do that again, right? So I think that's, it's extreme, but I think it proves the point that because of the way that the product of a therapeutic as a product is being so different, and your work with the end customer actually not working out the same way, it's really, there's just a certain, different set of challenges. And this is why I said in the beginning, therapeutics development is actually just one part of biotech science, right? There's other companies that can do, device development, and that's like hardware engineering, where, I think Agile actually becomes more potent again, and we can discuss that. All right, and so when you think about when to set up Agile teams and how to measure their success, we also started thinking about that a little bit more. Really what I distilled it into is answering two key questions. First question is there a possibility and an advantage for iterating quickly? And if the answer to that is yes, great, right? You're probably in a good state. And then secondly, can decisions easily be reverted? And that's an assessment of risk. And for the clinical trials, the answer there is like, heck no. And for therapeutics development, the answer is like, oh, it's painful, right? But in research, I think if you sandbox it, there is an opportunity. And so what we initially played with at Mantra is how we set goals for those Agile teams. And, one thing that we came to was that, we looked at Google and said, they're doing these OKRs, and we're going to try to copy what they do. And then we're going to hand those goals to the Scrum teams, and they're going to figure out what they can do with the key results for that. And the one struggle we always come back to is that, the classic example from Google is, you have a customer base of 100,000 people, you want to increase it by 20%. You set the OKR to be your measurement is, 20% increased customer base. And if you have 0.7, if you hit the 0.7 of that, you're good, right? So there's quantifiable output focused metrics. And if you do that in science, that's actually weird, right? Because our progress isn't linear, it's stepwise. It's a binary function. It's like, does this work? Yes or no. Does this work? Yes or no. If I try to hit it and quantify it in a way that I say, okay, if I hit 0.7%, 70% of this, right, the 0.7 metric, does it mean yes or no? All right, so there was a lot of uncertainty around that, where it was clear that that wasn't most effective. Another challenge that we had, particularly in the research piece, was that most of the times we were failing our OKRs because, we set output goals and like, we're going to have this ready. And then the answer was always like, no, we didn't have that ready, right? So that was really demotivating. And the idea that we had there that I think works really well, particularly if you're unsure, so there's a lot of uncertainty in the work that you do, is actually focus on input and progress or process goals, right? Instead of saying like, hey, I'm going to have this technology develop, say, I'm going to test 3 hypotheses, that might get me to this point. That's one metric. Another metrics that you can have is around learnings, like how many attempts on shots on goal did you have, and how many learnings did you generate? And that's a metric how you can actually assess how smart your team is about going out doing experiments, right? If that number is really low, it means you're just doing a lot of experiments that don't mean anything and you don't learn anything from it, right? So that mind shift has really helped with the research phase of things. As soon as you go into like the develop the product and improve an existing product, you can use the quantifiable output goals. And basically what I'm trying to relay with this slide is that there are phases that I think are similar between software and therapeutic development, but then there's other phases that are very dissimilar. Like to develop the product in the software space means something very different than developing a product in the therapeutic space. And then funny enough, improving on existing product actually never happens in therapeutics developments. You get to the point where you have the drug, you're not going to say, I'm going to make this drug 20% more effective and try again, simply because the cost of clinical trials is so enormous, right? You get that one shot on goal, and that one shot goal needs to work. And the next time you try to solve the same thing, it's typically very unattractive, right? So investors are going to tell you like, hey, there's already existing, standard of care for this. Why do you think you're going to be better? You have to be like 10x, 100x better, or really solve something that they couldn't get. And so there's a huge burden due to the cost and the risk that's associated with it. Now, as I said, I think there are other biotech companies like, the ones that are focusing particularly on platforms or services or medical devices or engineering products, where I think, Agile, due to the nature of the product and the fact that you can talk to your customer and you get those feedback loops and the lowered risk, for the development, will actually benefit from the approach as well. I personally haven't haven't done medical device engineering, and I still think, I talk to friends that work with, that build microscopes, and they sell, 5 of those microscopes a year. Still sounds like a pretty shitty development cycle for me if you're trying to talk to your customers. But maybe there's a way, right? But the beauty of being able to, have your website up and running, and then run an ad campaign and an A/B test through Facebook and Instagram, whatever people are doing, that's just simply not something that we have, right? So yeah, and with that, I'm gonna switch into like how to make it work if you decide that you want to try out Agile. And there's really 3 things that I want to relay here. One is make sure that the roles are clear. People are going to be confused, particularly if you overlay it with structures like, is a director a PO? Yes or no, right? How does that work? Where does the science fall? And just make sure that your base roles are already clear to then overlay the Agile roles, and think about how that blending is going to work in terms of accountability and clarity for the roles. And then assembling the right team. That's really key. I think I mentioned in the beginning that you start seeing these benefits of better resourcing when you have people that have the same skills and are able to carry out the same pieces of experiments. Really make sure that you assemble teams so that they're not only complementary in their expertise, but they have some sort of shared skill level so that they can actually help each other out, right? And for software people that's coding, for us that's pipetting, right? Every scientist in the lab can pipette, and probably every scientist in the lab should be able to run a DNA gel and qPCR assays, etc., or grow some cells. Focus on those and make those work packages in your experiments. And then the last thing is basically what I just mentioned, like provide the right success environment, make sure that the goals are clear. And if you're thinking about running an R&D group, particularly a research group, what I think works best, because the outcomes are so unclear and it's so hard to put them on Gantt chart, simply think about it from a company perspective. To say, like, I'm going to dedicate 10% of all my resources to the sandbox. That's this research sandbox. I'm going to tell the people, like, you have 3 months, you're going to get these 10%, go and figure something out. And then write off those resources and don't, forget about them for like 3 months and only revisit afterwards, right? Because this constant check-in and putting it on roadmap is just going to be, a thorn in the side, and it's actually not, the best way of approaching it. So providing the right environment in terms of goals and structure and resources is really key to make it work. And yeah, with that, I'm coming to my final slides. I hope I'm good on time. Actually, that's the one thing I never had in. Yep, I think we're right on time. Want to end with saying, I think I'm very confident that Scrum makes research teams, whether it's in academia or in biotech or pharma companies, very effective, more collaborative and transparent. And that's actually feedback I've gotten from scientists saying that really hated Agile in the beginning. I'm like, this does not make any sense. My experiments don't work in a sprint. They come to me now and say, like, if I would have had these techniques earlier, my career would have looked different, because I would have been able to put out a lot more good stuff. And so I highly encourage anybody to try this out. If your work is highly uncertain, set up input or process goals and not output goals, just to keep the motivation up. And if there's no benefit from iterating or a massive risk for the company from the failure, don't use Agile, use a phase gate where you have clear accountability up to the CEO level to make those go, no-go decisions. And then lastly is what Chris mentioned in the beginning, really look for fit for need. So identify if you have a problem that Agile is might be a good fit for, rather than assuming that just because everybody else is doing, you should be doing it. And so you can do that by asking, what is the issue that my team and organization have that I could be adopting by having the Agile mindset? And then if you identify that, just start simple and small and don't overbuild it. And I find that we at Herophilus, the first company, we basically started it with Post-it notes, and then it built a Notion, basically a very simple Kanban board, and we started with that, and we worked from there, and that was easy, because it's always easier to add more elements than getting the team trained on something that's very complex and then actually taking away elements once they've gotten used to them. So untraining people is really hard. So focus on adding it, and then yeah, learn from others, but make it your own. So you've done the first step. You know, we've learned today, hopefully something, but don't take any of this for granted and think that it might perfectly work for your system. But you know, I'm here to answer any of the questions that you have, and yeah, looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.